Well, comrades, welcome to the United States of Trump. So much for summer school, right? We're not going to go into the part 2 of the School of the Democrats. We're going to go straight into a postgraduate course in chaos, instability, and a very interesting time. And this is what we mean when we say that events will transform people's consciousness. This is what we mean when we say that we've entered an era of war, of crisis, of revolution, of counter-revolution. These are the sharp and sudden changes that we're always talking about. And when we say that nature abhors a vacuum, and that if it's not filled by a conscious political expression of the working class, all kinds of wild and wonderful things can take its place, this is exactly what we're talking about. And if any of you have seen Donald Trump in the last few months, you know exactly what wild and wonderful means. And that's precisely why we need to educate ourselves now in the Marxist method, why we need to get organized now as revolutionary Marxists in order to prepare for these events which can seemingly come out of a clear blue sky. But obviously we understand that the sky wasn't clear, the sky wasn't blue. We could see the signs, you could see what was coming. Everything was there. You could see, although you didn't know exactly what expression it was going to take, we knew that something big was happening. And in 24 hours, things were transformed. In fact, within minutes, I'd say, if you were staying awake on Tuesday night to watch the elections, from one microsecond to the next, there was a mass awareness around the world that something fundamental had changed. And that's when we talk about dialectics and tipping points, that's exactly what we're talking about. And in the last few days, this idea of American bourgeois democracy is the greatest form of government, the only form of government, a government that should be exported around the world, imposed by force if necessary, has been completely exposed as a sham. Millions of people around the world, billions of people are now wondering just, what is happening over there. But we understand what's happening, and we're going to act on that understanding, and that's what we're here today and this whole weekend to discuss. So-called lesser evilism has been dealt an absolutely devastating blow. I won't say it's dead completely, because until something comes along to replace it, it's going to keep limping along. But a lot of people, millions more people, have serious doubts now about that so-called strategy for stopping the so-called the right. Because ultimately, this is a nightmare scenario for the ruling class themselves. This is not what they wanted when they started out 18 months ago getting ready for this election. Former Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, William Cohen, said that the country is, quote, slouching towards the mutual assured destruction of our political system, unquote. I think that shows the degree of fear that the ruling class has over the forces that have been churned up and that they aren't going to be able to control in the long term. Of course, they're going to try to make the best of it, although if you look at Obama's face or Hillary Clinton's face, when they're trying to deal with this transition, it's absolutely clear that this is not what they wanted, it's not what they expected. And the emperor has basically been exposed, that it doesn't have any clothes, and I don't think any of us want to see that literally with Donald Trump. But as far as the system is concerned, people have realized that this myth of the American dream, this myth of the almighty, powerful United States, of this almighty democracy, has been completely blown apart. Now, Trump may be a bit of a lunatic, but he's not a lunatic with a capital L. The capitalists are not going to continue their charade of democracy if they really think they're going to lose control by handing power over to this guy. They're not going to give this guy the keys to Dad's new Porsche unless he agrees that he's going to drive very safely. And if you saw his demeanor after he came out and he accepted basically the presidency, it was very different than on the campaign trail. He specifically mentioned the Secret Service and that he wouldn't want to mess with those guys. And I can only imagine what kind of meeting he had just been in. When they explained to him how things were going to work from now on. Obviously, he's not completely under their control by any means, but they're doing their best to rein this process in. And of course, this came about because the ruling class is completely out of touch with what's going on in the society that they rule. if you'll remember, Hillary Clinton thought that Hosni Mubarak couldn't possibly be overthrown, right? Very poor foresight. And she showed the same lack of foresight when it came to her own electoral campaign. And obviously it was quite a big surprise. Now, very few people thought that this was possible. Now, we didn't necessarily think that this was the most likely scenario, but we certainly thought that it was an alternative. We thought that, and we're not taken by surprise. That's why we were able to react immediately with an analysis that explains these processes, because we've been following it for quite a long time. Not just this particular electoral cycle, but for decades, really, understanding what's been going on, where this country comes from, where it's at today, and where it inevitably needs to go, even though that's not going to unfold exactly the way we would like it to happen. All the ingredients were there. There was anger at the establishment. There was the hatred against Hillary Clinton. There was the capitulation of Sanders, the one candidate who could have enthused everybody and who people were genuinely enthused about and could have transformed the whole thing if he'd played the role that he could have played as an individual in history. And of course, the big crowds that Donald Trump was getting. The enthusiasm, frankly, and the hope, people hoping for change they could believe in. On a different side of the political spectrum than we saw, at least the narrow U.S. political spectrum, than we saw with Obama, but the same basic kind of mood we saw. And so none of us are really surprised at that. But I think we should not forget that the real story of 2016 was the rise of Bernie Sanders, and what that means. Again, as we've said time and again, a self-identified socialist who calls for political revolution against the billionaire class. That's never happened in this country. And we shouldn't discount, despite the disappointment of what he did ultimately at the DNC, despite what he's doing now in relation to Trump and the Democratic Party and so on, he's awakened forces that we can now connect with on a much more advanced layer than we could just a couple of years ago. And so as contradictory as it may seem, because we know who Donald Trump is, we know what he represents, but as contradictory as it may seem, millions of people think that, this is real change, this is fundamental change, and it's a giant you-know-what to the establishment. And of course, Americans like to do that quite a lot. They like to take things into their own hands. They like to break a few things. They like to smash a few things. And this is their way. I think Michael Moore said, Donald Trump is the Molotov cocktail against the establishment that this layer of the working class ultimately has been waiting for to express their dissatisfaction with what's taken place over the last 30 years in this country. But we also understood what would happen if Trump actually won. And we've seen instantly, the very same night, mass spontaneous protests. Since then, we've seen even more protests. We've got a little gallery of just a few of the cities where we've seen mass protests. Here in New York, I think something like 10,000 people were out. They're out again today. I don't see how this is going to stop anytime soon. Obviously, at some point, these kinds of movements will ebb. They'll run their course a bit. But it's not going away anytime soon. January 20th, the inauguration in Washington, D.C., will probably be the biggest demonstration in this country, at least since the beginning of the Iraq War, possibly even bigger than anything that we've seen ever in this country. So we've got to keep our eyes on that. Now, I would say that it's not necessarily a bad thing that Sanders lost at this particular juncture, especially now that we see what attitude he's taking in relation to Trump and the Democrats. Because the next president is going to inherit, an ugly, ugly political and economic crisis. And if that had fallen on someone who called himself a socialist and called for revolution, that could have made things a little bit more complicated for us. Now, eventually, the working class will have to go through the experience of having someone like that in power, whether it's Sanders or someone else, a left reformist trying to work within the limits of capitalism. But this gives us more time to build up our forces, to be more of a factor when we get to those more advanced stages of the class struggle. So this is all part of a worldwide process, and everybody here that follows the world situation, you know that this is just a very peculiar and particular American variant of what we're seeing all around the world. And what we're seeing are the convulsions of a system that can no longer take us forward, and in fact is starting to drag humanity back. And if we don't make the leap forward to a new form of social, political, and economic organization, we are going to go to a very, very ugly place. But of course, all of us in this room are very confident that on the basis of this experience, we are going to make that leap forward to genuine freedom. Now, the Donald is very quickly going to learn that ruling a bourgeois government is very different than tweeting 2 in the morning or whatever, or running all these dumb businesses of his. He's going to find it very difficult to maintain the illusions that his base have in him, while trying to balance within a party that didn't want him to be their candidate in the first place. Plus all these very unfair protests taking place on the streets, which he's complained about. It's very unfair. The media is misrepresenting him because you've got hundreds of thousands of people protesting him. This is a completely new era, and it's going to be ugly in a lot of ways, but I also think it's going to be a bit amusing quite a lot of the time. Now, because the Washington Post said. Just this morning, they said, if you voted for Trump because he's anti-establishment, guess what? You got conned. These people already, he's reversing on Obamacare. They asked him if he's going to jail Hillary, and he said, "Oh, I haven't really thought about that too much." He hasn't even gotten into power yet, and he's already taking steps back on some of those things. So it's going to be very interesting, and it's going to be very fast. We've got to stay on our toes. The last few years have been kind of slow, but we've got to stay on our toes now, because things are going to change from day to day, and sometimes from minute to minute, as we saw on Tuesday night. Because right now we're passing through a period where instead of just people kind of going through their lives day by day, week by week, month by month, nothing really changes, year by year, decade by decade, nothing really happens. Now, in the space of 24 hours, a lot is happening. And people are waking up and they're looking for ideas. And the fact that we got literally standing room only in our room here, because we planned to hold this meeting here before the Donald was elected, shows that there is a thirst for ideas. And that's what we've got to keep our eye on. Now, it's been said already that Marx talked about the whip of counter-revolution, spurring on the revolution, pushing things forward, and that's exactly what we're starting to see. Anybody who was out on the street trying to sell the paper, we sold, I think, more papers in a few hours than we sold the entire last month here in New York City the other day. Because people are angry. They can't accept the fact, young people especially, can't accept the fact that you have a racist, homophobic, misogynistic, xenophobic monster as the president of their country. And they realize now that this nice, peaceful, voting at the ballot box for Obama, hoping that Sanders is going to win the primary, really holding their nose multiple times to maybe vote for Clinton, none of that's going to work. We're going to have to struggle. We're going to have to fight if we want to change this society. And so lots of people who have been sitting on the fence, frankly, are now realizing, you know what, I can't just sort of, I got to pick sides here. I got to pick sides. And then the last few days, we've had so many contacts from all over the country who want to get involved, who want to join the IMT. People who maybe drifted a little bit from activity, who are all of a sudden, this cold bucket of water has been thrown on them. They realize, I can't just stand on the sidelines of history anymore. I've got to get involved as well. And it's going to take all of us together to be able to pull all that energy together, to hold it together, to consolidate ourselves, to learn, to educate, to learn these ideas, these methods, this history, in order to make sure that the next big leap in consciousness, we're in an even better position to take advantage of it. Now, elections, and especially bourgeois elections, they don't tell the whole story. They're only a snapshot. They're a very imperfect snapshot, but they, of the mood at a given time. But nonetheless, they are a very interesting snapshot. If you look at a map, for example, of the changing electoral control of this country since its founding, you can see long periods of stasis where one or another party more or less dominates, or where a couple of parties more or less share power. And then you see these rapid transformations where the old parties are destroyed, the old politicians are wiped out, and new parties arise, new forces arise, new political formations, new conglomerations of the political map, if you will. So we shouldn't poo-poo bourgeois elections, because they are one of the only forms of political expression that people have these days. And so we're always, interested in this. But I got to say, realistically, this is the first time that the elections have been really, really interesting. Obviously, 2008, there was a lot going on with the crisis happening, and after all the years of Bush and everything, that was interesting. But this is on a completely different level. Because in the final analysis, all political parties represent one class or another, or one layer of a class or another, and as the underlying economic basis for their rule decays and starts to come apart, so too do their political and ideological forms. Now, there's not a linear mechanical relationship between those aspects, those components of our social life, but there is a relationship there, even if it's not instant and automatic. Because it's taken now several waves of crisis, several waves, really going back to the 80s, we could say, to start eroding really the material gains of the post-war boom, to really melt away the accumulated fat that this country in particular was able to put together in that post-war period, because the United States emerged from World War II as the most powerful imperialist power, accounting for 50% of world GDP in 1945. It's taken quite a long time for that objective basis to melt away, and now finally we're seeing a reflection in politics, and nothing could be clearer reflection of that than the events of the last 18 months in U.S. politics. Because the boom is long over. There's no more crumbs to be had. There's no more crumbs to be had at a time when the workers can see the technology we have available, they can see the productivity, they can see the absurdity of all this unused capacity, and they understand that life doesn't have to be this way. They might not be quite clear yet what life could be or should be, but they know that something is fundamentally wrong with the way things are set up. Now, Trump is putting together, I don't know, a cabinet, I guess they call it. But it's absolutely, it really is a circus. You got Newt Gingrich, Rudy Giuliani, Ben Carson was mentioned earlier, maybe possibly Sarah Palin might be coming back, Mike Huckabee. It's the absolute reactionary fringe jokers. Even the Republican Party tried to bury these people and get rid of them. It's really incredible. John Bolton, he's the worst. For Latin American policy, that's going to be a nightmare. But you know what? Again, the whip of counter-revolution is going to spur so much. I got to say, 8 years ago, or 10 years ago, when Bush was in power, work around, say, hands off Venezuela. A lot of people were interested because it seemed imminent that Bush was going to attack Venezuela. We had a lot more interest in that kind of a thing. Now that kind of stuff is going to pick up again because under Obama they thought for some reason that he wasn't attacking Venezuela. Of course, he had a much gentler approach to try to undermine the Bolivarian Revolution, but now it's going to be potentially much more open, confrontational, not just in Latin America, but around the world. But with this cast of clowns in power, which is basically like putting a bunch of foxes in the hen house and then throwing a couple wolves in there as well. This is the winning party. The winning party, they're not going to be winners very long with this group of people, because he also has control of Congress. And that means that there's no excuses for him and for that party not to deliver on his promises. But remember, these are his promises. These are his little tweets. This is not the Republican Party platform. And it's going to be absolute. The civil war that we saw brewing in the Republican Party a few months ago, they're trying to paper things over for now, but you better believe it's going to have some really explosive convulsions in the next period. Now, what we've seen in the recent period also a reversal of globalization, of world trade. And that's an organic expression of the inability of the system to supersede the nation state and the market economy. And so free trade deals like NAFTA or political setups like the EU were attempts to get beyond those limits. You could make something of an analogy with credit, the way Marx talks about the role of credit in expanding the market artificially beyond its more natural borders. But even that artificial expansion has its limits, and we're starting to see the unraveling of globalization. You're starting to see a decline in world trade. You're starting to see the revival of things that really should have been superseded 100 years ago if we had succeeded with the Socialist Revolution, if the Russian Revolution could have spread throughout the whole world. Because only socialism with a world-planned economy, a democratically planned economy, the abolition of borders, only that's going to be able to supersede the nation state and the market. And that's why we have to get rid of those two fetters of humanity. And so despite Obama can't understand why people are angry about the economy. You know, unemployment is half what it was when he first came to power. You know, it's still almost, have we passed, is it the longest boom in history yet?
Not yet.
Just about. We're just about statistically to the longest recovery period after a slump in history. And he's wondering, you know, why are people so pissed off? Well, it's because for most people, the Great Recession never really ended. Now, unfortunately, the labor leaders, as well as Bernie Sanders, Richard Trumka, for example, they haven't learned anything from this process. They're blinded by their allegiance to this system. They're blinded, ultimately, to their lack of confidence in the working class and the ability of the working class to run society better than the people that are running society into the ground right now. So instead of vowing to fight Trump tooth and nail on the streets, in the factories, with strikes, general strikes, whatever is needed to stop these people, without saying we're breaking with the Democrats, we're starting our new party, we're going to fight politically, in 2020 we're going to take the presidency, whatever, they're saying, oh, well, we'll work with you as long as you're not too racist. And if you're racist, we're gonna say some stuff, because that's bad. I mean, they've learned absolutely nothing, but what is clear is that their hold on the rank and file, not just in the unions, but the broader labor movement, workers who aren't in organized unions, their control over these people is obviously greatly diminished. Now, if you look at voter turnout and interest in this election, there's some really interesting statistics out there. They figure that there's a participation rate of about 55.6%, which is the lowest since Bush-Kerry 2004. So that means that despite everything that was supposedly at stake, that we were told, fascism was coming, millions of people actually didn't come out to vote. In fact, 37 million fewer people voted last Tuesday than they did in 2008, even though the population has grown by something like over 20 million since 2008. And compared to 2012, when Obama was reelected, there's about 9 million fewer voters participated, and 7 million of those who didn't vote this time, that voted last time, were Democrats. And about 2 million were Republicans who didn't vote for Trump either. So in places like Detroit, in places like Milwaukee, in states that were, safe states for Hillary, she lost by tens of thousands of votes, just enough to tip the balance of those states towards the more conservative rural areas, and that tipped the balance then in the Electoral College. Now there's an app called the Brigade app, and they have a poll that it's supposedly quite accurate, because the way they pose the question seems to elicit the most honest answers out of people being polled. And before the election, they found that 2% of Republicans said they would vote for Hillary. 2% would flip and vote for Hillary. As far as Democrats, 40% of Democrats, people who consider themselves Democrats, registered Democrats, said they were going to vote for Donald Trump. And more Democratic Party affiliated women voted for Trump, switched parties, than men. 29% of Latino voters, including 26% of Latina women, voted for Trump. Despite everything, despite him launching his campaign with an assault against immigrants from Latin America in particular. And of course, the reason is that people thought that he wasn't this cardboard cutout like Hillary Clinton. They literally said stuff like, we like him because he's not working off a teleprompter or a script fine-tuned by consultant and focus groups, which was painfully obvious when it came to Hillary Clinton. So a lot of working class women they understood that Hillary was more interested in breaking her own glass ceiling than in improving the quality of life of all women, of all workers. Now, just 8 years then, since hope and change and everything else that Obama promised, Obama is going to end the presidency with the Democrats with 11 fewer Senate seats, 60 fewer House seats, 14 fewer governorships, and about 900 fewer seats in the state legislatures than when he was first elected. I mean, that is an incredible condemnation of this guy who, on the surface is one of the more popular presidents we've ever had, with his charm and his good looks and all that kind of stuff. Absolute condemnation of those policies. And Obama, let's not forget, he controlled Congress for the first 2 years, 2008 to 2010. He could have passed anything. He could have, ended NAFTA. He could have abolished Taft-Hartley. He could have approved card check unionization, which would have allowed millions more workers to unionize. He could have done all kinds of stuff, universal health care, etc. He didn't do anything. And the discontent with the Democrats and with Obama started way back then. But again, there was nothing to replace it at that time. I don't have time to talk about the Electoral College, but let's just suffice it to say that Hillary won the popular vote. She seems to right now be about 500,000 votes ahead of Trump in terms of popular vote. But because this country is fundamentally undemocratic, as we've said before, 0 people voted for president last Tuesday. Not a single American voted for president. They now have to live with Donald Trump. I mean, there is some noise. Some states are saying, "Oh, well, maybe we shouldn't follow through on this. We should vote for whoever got the actual vote." But if she actually came to power on the basis of the Electoral College at this stage, reversing their position, it would be completely ungovernable. I mean, and they don't want that mess, and that's why she has, been humiliated and has taken herself off the stage of history, probably, hopefully, for the last time. Now, a lot of the talk these days is about how polarized the country is, and how it's more angry and divided than ever. And we would agree. I think we would agree that we've never seen this kind of polarization in our lifetimes. But along what lines? Is it along black and white, male and female, gay and straight, urban and rural, racists and non-racists? Superficially, those all seem like possible answers. And those are some of the explanations that were given. But we're Marxists, and we have to look beneath the surface of events, and we understand that while those aspects of identity, those aspects of oppression cannot be ignored by any means, the key division in society is class. And what we're seeing is, in a very confused, typically American, weird way, is the beginnings of the class differentiation in society. And we're at the early stages of this, so of course it's going to be a bit weird. But a lot of the voters for Trump, a lot of them absolutely, they're racists and misogynists and so on, but not all of them. A lot of them actually see him as a champion for the working class. In Virginia, the chairman of the Virginia Trump campaign said, quote, "This is a working class revolution. No one saw it coming. Working class Americans have been sold down the river by the establishment, by the Wall Street slavery class." I mean, we didn't write that. The chairman of Donald Trump's Republican campaign wrote that. That tells you something's changed in American politics, right? Frank Bruni of the New York Times called him their agent of disruption. The mayor of a little town in Pennsylvania, a Rust Belt town in Pennsylvania, I heard on the radio the other day, he said, if ISIS came here, they would keep on going because they would think somebody had already bombed it. I mean, you go to some of our big cities and some of our smaller rural areas, that's exactly what it looks like. They've been hit hard by globalization, by capitalist globalization. So another quote worker says, "Nobody has been able to fix my problem. Trump tells me he can." Okay, fair enough. What's an American pragmatist to do? So, and so of course the labor movement, and we wrote about this. We wrote about this in our perspectives a few years ago. The Democrats have taken labor's vote, the workers' vote, for granted for so long that they don't even pay lip service to it anymore. And you end up with a situation where in Wisconsin and Michigan, 50% of union workers voted for Trump. And in Ohio, another used to be absolutely safe blue state, 52%, a majority of union workers voted for Trump. And as they put it, they said, it's 30 years of getting screwed by both parties, Democrats and Republicans. They were willing to take a chance on anything, and that includes people in the AFL-CIO. So Trump demagogically denounced NAFTA, he denounced free trade pacts, he visited those areas, which the Democrats didn't even bother visiting, and he talked about this stuff. And he understood that there's a huge amount of discontent and that people were ready to take a chance on basically anything. Now, what did Hillary do? She called these people, most of whom were workers, a basket of deplorables. Well, of course they got mad. Of course they said, oh yeah, we're going to show you. Just like we'll talk about tomorrow, a lot of the beat-up areas of the working class in England and Britain said the same thing about Brexit. They said, we'll teach the people in Washington, we'll teach the people in Westminster a lesson. So no wonder they turned against her. Now, without a Labour Party alternative, they turned to someone who they thought could get her done. I mean, that's what you do. You get things done, and this guy looks like a guy who can get things done. So the United States is a land of, I would say, quite glorious contradictions. If you enjoy history, if you enjoy dialectics, I mean, this is the place to study. It's often ridiculed. I see some Europeans laughing over here. But there's also deep revolutionary class struggle traditions in this place, which are going to reemerge in the years ahead. I'm going to quote a little quote from Trotsky. It's a little long, but it's worth quoting in full. It's from 1940, at a time when, of course, the world was in a similar period of chaos. After a period of stabilization after World War II, we're now back to a situation similar, but in many ways far more objectively positive from our point of view from what Trotsky was writing at that time. And he says the following. He says, "The backwardness of the United States working class is only a relative term. In many very important respects, it is the most progressive working class of the world, technically and in its standard of living. The rapid lowering of the standard of living for the working class will produce a very rapid change of mind in the American workers. The American worker is very combative, as we have seen during the strikes in the 1930s. They have had the most rebellious strikes in the world. What the American worker misses is a spirit of generalization or analysis of his class position in society as a whole. Though this lack of social thinking has its origin in the country's whole history. The far west with the perspective of unlimited possibilities for everyone to become rich, etc. Now all that is gone, but the mind remains in the past. Idealists think that the human mentality is progressive, but in reality it is the most conservative element of society. Your technique is progressive, but the mentality of the workers lags behind. Their backwardness consists of their inability to generalize their problem. They consider everything on a personal basis. The economic crisis has already begun, and in the CIO, we see the first reaction of the workers. Confused, but important. They begin to feel themselves as a class. Now, we're a little bit before that stage, but we're entering a process where that feeling of being a class is going to start to crystallize in a way that we haven't seen for many, many decades. So in a weird way, we see different manifestations of class struggle with older, mostly older, white, and current industrial workers, and especially in the rural areas, orienting to the Republicans, the capitalist Republicans, to try to find a way out. And of course, younger, urban working class orienting, or have tried to orient, to the Democrats in the form of Bernie Sanders to try to solve their problems. But eventually, these two streams are going to have to find each other, because eventually the laws of the class struggle are going to assert themselves and force these things together. And once that comes together, once those two streams unite, we're going to have a raging torrent that's going to be impossible for the working class, for the ruling class to stop. Now, in the United States, we've long had a really bad conception of the middle class. We're supposedly all middle class, right? American workers are middle class, blah, blah, blah. But I would say that we also have been taught a wrong conception of left and right, this idea of what is left and what is right. And I think if we want to understand that, we have to get rid of this sort of academic understanding, the mainstream understanding of what left and right is. For us, the left is the forces that represent the interests of the working class, the forces that represent the future. And the right is all those forces that try to maintain the status quo, to try to maintain the conservative elements that want to keep things as they are, i.e. they want to maintain bourgeois rule. So for us, it's not about this particular policy, gun control, or that particular policy, voting rights, or whatever. Those parties can shift their positions on those things quite easily, and they have over time. The identities, if you will, the expressions of the Democrats and Republicans have changed several times over the last few decades. But the fundamental dividing line for us is whether or not you are a worker. Do you sell your labor power for a wage, or do you live off the dead and living labor of workers? That's the difference for us. So Populism, and we've talked a lot about populism this year, left populism, right populism. The aim of populism is to get workers to vote against their own interests by supporting a party that doesn't represent their interests. But this is what I haven't studied every single election in American history, but certainly in my lifetime, this is the only time that you've seen that extreme degree of it on both the left and the right. And once you took the left populist option out of the way, then people ended up going for the right populist version. And of course, what that ends up doing is dividing people into us versus them. But it keeps people from understanding us versus them in class terms, and gets people looking at us, the white workers, versus the immigrants stealing our jobs, or us, whatever division that they're able to get people to buy into. So let's be clear, the Democrats are not the left. The Democrats are not a left party. And the Republicans are not right in the sense that they're fundamentally different from the Democrats. Both parties have always been, and remain to this day, parties of the ruling class. At best, you could call them a conservative right party and a liberal right party. Although originally the Republican Party was a revolutionary party of the capitalist class, in the sense that they were formed historically to smash slavery, etc., etc. That's a whole other discussion. But ultimately, they both represent the same fundamental class interests. And it's only because of the peculiar experience of the last few decades that the Democrats could pose as the left, as the friends of labor. As we discussed earlier, FDR, and you have the Great Society with Lyndon Johnson. You have, John F. Kennedy, taking America to space. Of course, we know the real reasons why they needed to get up into space, because the Russians were going to get there first. But you had, they were able to pose left because there were a few crumbs that they were able to give for a period. But that is all finished, as we've said. And so after decades of stagnation, of underemployment, millions of workers weren't sure which the lesser evil was. I mean, that's just a fact. And so we shouldn't fall into that either. And if you'll notice in our recent material, we don't talk about the Democrats as the lesser evil anymore, because they're both evil. It was only useful to use that sort of comparison in the past because a lot of people believe that. But that is starting to be burned out of people's minds, and I think we should keep that in mind. Now, let's see. Yeah, so the workers, a lot of workers have like I said, the basis of these two parties has shifted over time, and a certain layer, not all workers by any means, but enough to tip the electoral college balance, shifted now to the Republicans. But that's a very unstable basis, because the Republicans don't have anything to offer either. And as I said, we're going to see that very quickly. And so not only are those that have illusions in the Republicans going to be angry, but you've got millions and millions of people that never had any illusions in Donald Trump, that are already losing their illusions in the Democrats, that are going to be looking for much more advanced alternative. And so you have this weird situation where honest aspirations for a better life are mixed up with xenophobia, with racism, with Islamophobia, with protectionism, with nationalism. And we've got to understand that. I think it's important for us to analyze that. It's a lot more complex than just saying, oh, Trump is on the right and this represents a shift to right in society. It's not that simple. Millions of people voted for Trump because they think he's going to think outside the box. But the only box that matters to us is the capitalist box. And he definitely doesn't think outside of that box. And that's what we've got to look at. So it's going to be a messy and complex process. As Trotsky explained in If America Should Go Communist, available right here at MarxistBooks.com. He explained that in the process of the American Revolution, there's going to be a few heads cracked, and there's going to be a few apple carts upset. And, whether we like it or not, that's the process of the class struggle. We're not in favor of violence, but if the ruling class uses violence against us, if thugs use violence against us, we're going to fight back. We're going to defend ourselves. Now, in the future, we're going to recruit some of these people that supported Trump. We're going to recruit some of these older workers, these Rust Belt workers and so on. But right now, our audience is the radicalized youth that's on the street chanting, "Fuck Trump, not my president." That is our audience right now. That's who we have to energetically go out and win. Now, as some of you may know, the first casualty of the Trump presidency was my leadoff on the Mexican Revolution. Picture up there. And, you all know that Trump has promised to build a wall, right? Well, you may not know that's not a very novel idea. Pancho Villa had an idea to dig a trench hundreds of meters wide, a giant ditch along the border to keep the gringos out. That was his plan. Now, obviously, that's not our program, but in the midst of the Mexican Revolution, we can understand the sentiment, right? No, but seriously, though, racism is an absolute poison. It's an absolute horrible thing to experience, as many of us in this room have experienced. It's a horrible thing to witness if you see your loved ones suffering from any form of bigotry or oppression. You've seen now that the KKK is planning a victory rally in North Carolina. David Duke said it's like, the greatest day in his life dream come true. You've got kids in elementary schools chanting, build a wall, to humiliate their Latino schoolmates. You have women being demeaned, and Hillary being blamed for being a woman, as opposed to all the other reasons that really explain why she's so hated. And we, of course, understand that the root cause of racism and of bigotry is scarcity. And the root cause of scarcity is the artificial scarcity of capitalism. And we need to fight against that. We need to explain to people that you're not going to stop racism in Congress. You're not going to stop racism merely by putting an angry face on Facebook or whatever. We're actually going to have to use the methods of mass struggle. We're going to have to win the leadership of the working class, to use the power of the working class, of the trade unions and the entire working class, to combat against this poison which divides us and makes it much easier for the ruling class to exploit and oppress us. Because the reality is that this country is not necessarily any more racist or homophobic than it was just a few days ago, but now these people are able to come out of the woodwork. They've found an opportunity to express themselves. And I would say, actually, so be it. Now that we know who these people are, we're of course going to try to convince them through methods of class struggle and solidarity. But there's other methods that the working class can use as well, if we need to stop this poison. Now, like I said, the 8 years we've lived under Obama have been relatively quiet. When's the last mass strike you heard of in the United States? I mean, really, like the 1997 Teamsters strike. When's the last time that happened? 1997. There's been no real big marches on Washington. During the Bush years, there was every once in a while there's marches on Washington. There's been very few protests, strikes, very big ebb in the class struggle. The Great Recession, of course, had an effect on people's consciousness and their willingness to fight. The labor leadership has moved so far to the right, cowering in fear of the greater evil, that they've completely become impotent. And of course, despite a few very important things like Occupy or the Wisconsin Uprising or Black Lives Matter, you've had some important events. It hasn't been a whole lot, and a certain amount of cynicism has crept into people. And some of that cynicism may have even crept into some of our own comrades who just kind of stuck with it because it was a bit of a habit, a bit of a routine. But there's no time for routinism now. There's no room for routinism in the work that we have to do, because everything has changed, and the scale of the class struggle in the next period is going to leave all the events of the last few years in the shade. Ultimately, even the Venezuelan Revolution, the Egyptian Revolution, and the Russian Revolution are going to be left in the shade by what's going to happen in this country and around the world. And that's why we have to build now. Now is the time. We have to have a sense of urgency, but also a sense of proportion. We have to recognize how big we are, but understand that every new member we have, every new book we read, every new leadoff we hear or give is a strengthening, part of the molecular strengthening of our organization. Now, the Democrats are already trying to pose left. We could have predicted that by getting such a drubbing. Now, of course, they've already started the countdown. Michelle Obama 2020. She's the one. Or Bernie Sanders, of course. Elizabeth Warren, Keith Ellison in Minneapolis, a real snake. And even Chelsea Clinton. They haven't given up on the Clinton man. They think she might be able to do it. Now, Michael Moore, who pretty much predicted Trump's victory, Like I said, he's learned nothing. He thinks that what we need to do is now's the time to take back the Democrats. As if people's attempt to do that, which we explained the complications of it, to say the least, under Sanders, as if that didn't fail miserably, now all of a sudden it's the time to take back the Democrats, according to him. We say, too little, too late, you've had your chance, you got to break with the Democrats, and we got to keep hammering away with that message. We got to just keep beating that into people's minds, because more and more people are understanding that that's the case. Because it's actually Obama's rule itself that prepared the ground for this. And if Trump had been stopped this time, eventually someone, potentially even worse, of so-called greater evil, would have gotten into power. And either way, we're going to have to go through this experience. The workers will have to go through this experience. But we must say that Trump as the greater evil is definitely a twist in the equation. It's a little bit different than anybody could have really imagined. But as night follows day, Trump himself is also going to prepare a shift. Not simply back to the Democrats, not simply back to the liberal bourgeoisie, the more liberal wing, but ultimately towards the formation of a mass working class party that's going to be open to socialist ideas. We're going to be in there fighting for our program, for a program of revolutionary socialism within that party. And it's going to be a very exciting time. If anybody thinks they're going to have a nice, quiet, easy life, you picked the wrong time to be born. Most of us don't get to pick that. None of us get to pick that, right? But we understand capitalism can't be managed, it can't be tinkered with, it can't be fixed, it's got to be overthrown. Trump has no popular mandate. Only about 25% of the voters voted for him. That doesn't count, 8 million people that are disenfranchised for whatever reason due to having felonies or whatever. I mean, not even a quarter of the voting population voted for him. Doesn't count all the 15, 16, 17-year-olds that are going to come of age under his rule that didn't have to have any say in it. Very few people actually voted for this guy. So this idea that people are just going to acquiesce is absurd. And that's what the ruling class is trying to impose, but we've seen already on the streets that that's not going to happen. Now, let's see. Yeah, because the big problem Mr. Trump has is that he can't just snap his fingers and come up with the trillions of dollars that he needs to implement his program. The Trump brand does not extend to loans, to intergalactic loans to solve the problems. I mean, that's why he looks like a deer in headlights these days. I don't think he expected to win. There was a lot of speculation in the past that he might even come out of, JK, just kidding, I'm out of here. But now he's stuck with it because he's had that little chat with the people in the back room, and he's got to do his part now to try to get things back on track. Because he's promised to return to a time when America was great. But most Americans don't yet understand that greatness, that very narrow window of time where things were pretty good for a lot of people, was based on a never-to-be-repeated convergence of factors that is gone, it's finished, and it's never coming back. And it only benefited a certain part of the population anyway. And now basically the majority are seeing what most of the world actually has to live under, and are realizing, I don't like this so much, maybe we should do something about it. So, none of us should mourn the demise, the decline, the death of the American bourgeois republic. Obviously the Constitution's still there on paper. The inertia of this society means that this form of government continues. But really, this is nothing like the Founding Fathers, as they're called, envisioned. And they certainly didn't expect that this particular Constitution would still be around 240 or so years later. Because this has never been our republic. We're fighting for a workers' socialist republic, and then we're going to have our government, our policies that are going to be put in place to benefit the working class. So we've been grinding away against the stream in a very complicated situation for a very long time. Some of us have been doing this for a very, very long time. Some of us have discovered these ideas relatively recently. Absolutely the best possible time to get involved. You learn so much more in a situation like this than grinding away year after year. But of course you do accumulate a bit of experience and a bit of knowledge and understanding of how things work on the bigger historical scale when you do go through that experience. But we finally assembled a little rowboat. We got this nice little rowboat here. It's It's a little bigger than a rowboat, but it's not that big. But if we're going to ride this rising tide that's coming, I mean, the real, I've talked about this before, the real tsunami of class struggle is coming. And if our little rowboat isn't going to get capsized, we've got to build up a real armada. We've got to build up a fleet of submarines, of aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, of revolutionary Marxism to ride that tide in and actually transform society. So, comrades, Marxists are not low energy, right? Marxists are not low energy. We're confident that the U.S. working class, along with the world working class, is going to make not just America, but the world great for the very first time. And it's going to be tremendous.